Okay, yeah, so I'm Steve Scott. I'm one of the public engagement leads at UK Research Innovation. So um, just in case anyone is not familiar with UK Research Innovation, we're the largest public funder of research in the UK, and we launched in 2018. This was a way of bringing together um, a range of different research councils that cover lots of different disciplines, from the arts and humanities and social sciences right through to physics, chemistry, maths, and biology. So we cover an awful lot of different areas of research, and fund everything from fundamental research through to applied. Um, so a large part of the work that we do is around public engagement. So I'd like to think that you've all read the UKRI vision for public engagement, but I'm realistic, and some of you might not have done. But in essence, the vision for public engagement at UKRI has kind of four main focus areas: engaging underrepresented communities and places, supporting researchers to actively involve a wide range of people in their work, and those two in particular are an area for focus for me, working in public engagement with research. So in my role, I'm looking particularly at how researchers, research organisations work with the public to engage them with the work that they do. Other areas that we also have a focus on is looking at young people and their relationship with research innovation, and also looking at public concerns and aspirations for research. So thinking about things like our work with ScienceWise and Dialogue. So like I say, the top two of the things that, in particular with the work that I do, I'm particularly interested in focusing on. And one of the things that we've done over the last couple of years is to look at how we've look at these in different ways, and to kind of experiment with how we fund public engagement and the types of public engagement that we fund. These are the kind of three main funding calls that we've run over the last couple of years. One of them was looking at those underrepresented communities and places through the Enhancing Place-Based Partnerships in Public Engagement Fund. And we also looked at citizen science. So initially through a kind of 6-month short-term project that was the exploration grants, and now over the summer, we have the collaboration grants, which are much bigger, long-term 3-year projects, looking at citizen science and participatory research methods. So we've used these as a way of experimenting, to see how we fund research. And I thought it was useful just to talk about them in terms of thinking about some of the challenges that these come up, and particularly thinking about the theme of this session, and how some of the things that you might want to think about when applying for funding, and how you might go about making the chances of success greater. So some of the common challenges that came out of these projects, we're talking about working with underrepresented communities and places, and partnerships is hugely important in that, and thinking about how you establish them, that takes time. And particularly for those EPI projects, these were really short-term projects. They were only 6 months long, although they were started just as the pandemic started. So as you can imagine, they had a little bit of an extension, and had to flex a little bit in terms of how they worked with those communities. But it really does take time to establish those partnerships, and that's something to really think about at the start before you even applying for funding, is thinking about those relationships that you're building. The other thing that came out about during these calls was thinking about the power dynamic. Who holds all the power? Usually it's the universities and the researchers. So when we're trying to make our relationships and our partnerships equitable, that can be really challenging when that power dynamic is maybe set up that, you've got a university that is used to dealing with lots of big amounts of money and funding. And maybe some of the community organisations do not have that benefit of having a large pot of money that they are working with, and therefore that can make it slightly challenging. And kind of related to that is thinking about where the money goes. And one of the challenges we have at UKRI is that at the moment, it's our predominant route to distributing money is to do it to universities. So we're immediately, that money is going to universities, and then they have to distribute it from there. So that's one of the challenges that we found, and thinking about that relationship and how you set up things to ensure that your partners get paid is a really important thing to think about. And as a consequence, thinking about those partnerships in terms of the application and how that relationship is set out from the outset. So we did have that challenge, particularly with these 3 funding calls, that the principal investigator on these funds had to be a researcher. That's how the process of funding was set up, that had to be a stipulation. And that's something we're looking at UKRI in terms of how can we make sure that from the outset, these power dynamics and these partnerships are much more equitable. So how can we actually give money to the people who need to be paid in order to do this work, rather than it necessarily going through a research council to the university. So that's something we're exploring to see how we can maybe change that a little bit. And thinking about one of the things that's sort of evolving is who is actually able to be a PI on a funding call. So it might not just be a professor, it might be now so more junior researchers, people that are at the start of their careers, and also people who maybe are in professional services within universities and research organisations. And then the other thing that we found was quite challenging is that short-term versus long-term sustainable projects, and particularly when working with underrepresented communities, we want to make sure that those relationships are sustainable, and thinking about what happens at the end of funding and how that relationship can continue and be sustainable for developing the next funding application and those sorts of things. So these are all challenges that kind of some of this lays with us at UKRI, how we develop our systems better and how we maybe adapt them now to broaden who can be part of these projects. But it's also, these are things to consider when you're thinking about your applications. And that's, this sets the stall for how that relationship is established. And I think in your applications, you can bring that across about the importance of those partnerships and how you've established them. So one of the funds that I talked about, introduced earlier, was the Citizen Science Collaboration grants. These were the larger scale projects. So we invested £1.5 million in 5 projects over 3 years. So they all started earlier this year. So they're just getting underway. And although this is called Citizen Science Collaboration Grants, this was not just about science. This was about participatory research generally. So different forms of engagement involving the public from the outset, integral to how that research is developed and delivered. So we wanted to make sure that those projects were societally relevant. They were addressing a challenge that was important to the communities that they'd be working with. We wanted them to develop and spread expertise in participatory research methods. So really be kind of trailblazers and sharing their experiences with the communities, with the sector, so the research community, and also to some extent developing new ways of working with the public and involving the public in research. So just as a kind of illustration, this is kind of an overview of the application process and a summary of it. And I think there's some interesting points to pull out of this in terms of the fact that we've got 162 applications. And we had to do an office sift, which was with public engagement professionals within the research councils and UKRI. And they were scored basically on their fit to call. So did they meet the 5 criteria? And half of them didn't. So they didn't make it through to the panel review. So key take home message, have a look at the fit to call criteria and make sure you're meeting them, because that's an instant way for you to get a black mark against your name. Then 73 applications went to panel review, and they were scored out of 7. And eventually we funded 5 projects. So admittedly, this process that we were inundated with applications, but a significant portion did not meet the fit to call. And the one thing is that those projects that we did fund were exceptional. So they scored 6 or above. And that was incredible. And the reason for that is because they'd really thought about the audiences they were working with. They'd really created equitable partnerships and thought about how they were going to approach things. So just kind of thinking about that, thinking about considering kind of clear purpose and things for your how you approach your public engagement. And I suppose, some of you may already be familiar with the kind of principles of quality engagement that the NCCP, National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, have on their website: the purpose, people, processes. But just thinking about that in terms of outcomes and impact. So, for us at UKRI, thinking about outcomes and impact is very important, and having that as the focus for engagement work. Thinking about the people you're working with. So for us, we're really interested in work that reaches beyond the usual suspects. A lot of engagement work tends to engage with people who already have an interest in research and innovation. We're particularly interested in trying to reach out to those groups that maybe are less represented and have fewer opportunities to engage with research and innovation. And we're really keen to make sure that those partnerships are sustainable. So people are thinking about what happens beyond the lifespan of a funding call, and also thinking about how those relationships are equitable and ethical. And ethical engagement, thinking about the ethics of how you work with some of these groups, particularly if they're underrepresented, is really vital. How are you considering their needs and making sure that you're not just parachuting in, getting what you need and going away again. And then thinking about the process as well. I think generally with applications, one of the things with our collaboration grants is that we did get a lot of applications, and that's a lot of work for people to review. So thinking about fitting to the funding criteria, but also thinking about the language you're using and not being too technical. We're all about engaging with different groups. So the more clearly you describe what you want to do in your public engagement, that's really important. So really thinking about the language and the fact that whoever's reviewing this stuff is probably reviewing a lot of applications, and that is quite draining. So I just wanted to finish by just giving you a couple of examples of the projects that we funded, because they're great projects and they're a real variety of different things. But at the heart of that is thinking about the group that they are working with and thinking about trying to address problems that are really important. So Homes Under the Microscope is a project that's based at the University of West England and the University of Leeds, and it brings together a collaboration of citizens, researchers, industry and community groups, and really is looking at airborne microplastics in the home, but getting citizens to be the people who explore that. So first of all, there's a small group that are going to be looking at the methodology. So how do we go about detecting and monitoring microplastics in the home? How do we do that effectively? And then from there, creating something that expands out and can be used with more people in different parts of the country. So it's really got the people at the heart of it. They're involved in all elements of the research, from creating those methodologies to making sure that the way that citizens are involved in the project is appropriate. And this is a really, microplastics is something that is very topical at the moment, but this is really going to help to identify where microplastics in the home come from, and maybe it might be to do with kind of throwaway fashions and other things might be the source of those microplastics, but really trying to understand where this problem arises from and how much of a problem it really is. So that's a kind of traditional citizen science. That might be what we immediately think of when we think of citizen science. But also, in addition to that, at the other extreme, there's a project working in Bristol, and this is looking at the legacy of the transatlantic slavery in Bristol. And this has been very topical with events that happened last year, and this is really bringing together people from across Bristol and organisations, grassroots organisations that work with the Black community in Bristol, but also the libraries, the council, the university, and bringing them together to explore a lot of this, the kind of history of slavery in Bristol and that contemporary legacy now, and really bringing everyone together to work on this and to make sure that the different perspectives are listened to, and the way that that's done is kind of ethically in the right way, considering the sensitivity of the subject. So it involves, there'll be active and equal participants in the project from Bristol, from all different communities, and that's going to provide critical knowledge and experience that kind of expands beyond the existing academic knowledge around this subject. So I just wanted to share those two examples with you, just to give you a kind of flavour of some of the great projects that are going to be funded through that, but also how they've approached it, and how, you know, the audience and that kind of active participation is a key part of it, because that's something we're really interested in. It's working with underrepresented communities, but also enabling them to be much more actively involved in the research process. And so that is, you know, there's a whole spectrum of engagement that people can do around their research, but really trying to get into the heart of how we can involve communities in research much more actively. And I think, you know, where we're going with that is thinking about, well, how can we start to have communities lead the research? So it's actually their ideas and them delivering it, and looking at different ways of creating knowledge and understanding of different aspects of research innovation. So I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch, those are my contact details, and yeah, look forward to hearing what the rest of the panel have to say and discussions later on.